All right, hello everybody. This is to finish up our notes on East Asia that we ran out of time for in class. The first couple of slides correspond to page 57 in your interactive notebook. We made it all the way through the part about Confucianism, but we didn't get to talk about Taoism much. We have talked a lot about it in class, but I just want to highlight a few things that are within the key concepts. So first of all, an important part of Taoism is a balance with nature. So Taoists believe that if they focus on the balance between themselves and nature, that everything else will kind of fall into place because the universe will be at peace, if you will. So there's a lot of examples of the influence of Taoism within Chinese culture, and that includes medical theories and practices, things like acupuncture, as well as poetry, metallurgy, and architecture. And all of these things, you'll see a big focus on nature. Right, there's also this video posted about Taoism. I'm not going to show it to you here. This presentation in full is posted in Google Classroom, so you can always go back there to watch it. All right, this particular key concept is about art and architecture, and it says that the art and architecture of these early civilizations reflected the values of their own belief systems. So when we think about China, this is actually kind of like a non-example because Confucian principles did not lend themselves to extravagance. There's not actually a lot of monumental architecture in China. When you think comparing it to the architecture that we'll see in Greece and Rome, or even comparing it to the pyramids and ziggurats and things of that nature, Confucian principles focus on like humility and being humble and being efficient and living simply. So there's not really any examples of monumental architecture within East Asia, but we do see these principles reflected in art a lot. So here is an example of some Chinese art. This is a carving in jade, and the quote is just from an article that you can find in the speaker notes on the other presentation, but it's focusing on the human understanding of these forces, so forces within nature. So we'll see a lot of landscape paintings, bamboo, birds, flowers, all kinds of nature within Chinese art. Here's another example of Chinese art. It's this particular one is tomb pottery, which means that it's a piece of pottery that would have been buried with somebody. If you kind of think like along the lines of Shi Huangdi and his terracotta warriors, that was a practice in Chinese culture at the time. Again, focusing on nature, this particular pot is focusing on the stars and constellations. So we have Sirius for my Harry Potter fans, the Heavenly Wolf. And again, it's celestial, so dealing with nature and constellations. We've talked a lot about this already, but just a reminder that Confucianism emphasized filial piety, right? And this key concept is about reinforcing existing social structures. So filial piety reinforces the patriarchy because it says that you're supposed to respect your parents, that sons should respect their fathers, etc. This particular key concept is about incorporating traditions into other major religious belief systems. So the one that we're going to focus on here for East Asia is the idea of ancestor veneration or ancestor worship. This was a common cultural practice that had already existed in East Asia, and it becomes an important part of Confucianism. And just to remind you, ancestor worship is the idea of continuing to pay respect and reverence to ancestors even after they have died. All right, so now we are finally to day 3 notes, which corresponds with your page 58 handout that should be in your interactive notebook. And this is a key concept that we've already seen before. It's the idea that as these early empires grew, they competed for resources and often came into conflict with one another. Okay, so this particular key concept is about social hierarchies or social structures, and this is a general one for all empires, saying that they displayed hierarchies that included cultivators, farmers, laborers, slaves, artisans, merchants, elites, or caste groups. And so when we're talking about the Han Empire in particular, this is the social structure that existed at that time. So at the very top, of course, you have the emperor. He's not listed on this slide, but you know that the emperor is obviously at the very, very top. The top social class that comes next is sometimes referred to as the scholar gentry. This is a group of people that controlled large amounts of land. They weren't doing the farming directly, but they owned the land, and or they held positions within the bureaucracy. Underneath the scholar gentry, you have the free citizens or the common people. The majority of this group is made up of peasants. If you belong to this group, you're required to work on public works, so like construction projects, for example, for a certain number of days each year. And though some of this group of people might own their own land, the majority of them are going to be peasants who are working for someone that's part of the scholar gentry, that's part of that aristocracy. So they work for a landlord, essentially. And then the lowest group, the underclass, there are going to be some slaves in this group, but also if you are not Han, like if you are on the fringes of the empire, you're not culturally Chinese, then you would be part of the underclass as well. Okay, this is a key concept that talks about how did the imperial governments and imperial societies keep things going, essentially. How did they maintain food production? How did they provide rewards to people who are loyal to them, especially the elite people? So those people that own the land, how are they going to continue to stay loyal to the emperor? And one important idea here is that during the Qin dynasty, they followed legalist proposals. So legalism, remember, is a philosophy that says human nature is evil, and so people need harsh punishments and harsh laws, or society will crumble, essentially. So it was very harsh, and that's how the Qin dynasty achieved this. And then with the Han, because they adopted Confucianism, they taught everyone to follow that philosophy, and because Confucianism has those proper relationships built right into it, if you're following Confucianism, then you're going to obey the emperor. All right, this particular key concept is about patriarchy. Remember, that means it's a male-dominated society. And we already hit on this a little bit when we talked about filial piety, but essentially that is the driving force that is supporting the patriarchy. It's these Confucian ideals of filial piety. All right, so finally we are to key concept 2.3. With the organization of large-scale empires, trans-regional trade intensified, leading to the creation of extensive networks of commercial and cultural exchange. All right, this key concept says, land and water routes became the basis for interregional trade, communication, and exchange networks in the Eastern Hemisphere. The important ones here for East Asia is obviously the Silk Roads. We've talked a lot about that, but also Indian Ocean sea lanes, which, if you can imagine in your mind a map of the Indian Ocean and imagine merchants on ships sailing to and from India and China. This particular key concept is about new technologies that allow domesticated pack animals to better cross these routes, like the Silk Road. So if you're thinking about technologies and pack animals, okay, you're thinking about things like camels and horses and inventions or technologies like the saddle. All right, so this is just a quote from one of the articles. Again, I link these articles into the speaker notes on Google Slides. So if you ever want to read more of an article, you just can click on the link in the speaker notes and you'll see the whole thing. But this one is talking about how at this time in the Han Empire, you have one end of the Silk Road, right? It starts there. And on the other end is the Roman Empire, which we haven't started learning yet, but they're existing simultaneously. Okay, so that's important to think about. Remember when I told you guys that I teach it regionally, so we're studying the time period 600 to 600. We started in East Asia, and we're going to learn about South Asia, the Middle East, and then the Mediterranean. But all of this is happening at the same time. This key concept is talking about maritime technologies. That has to do with the ocean or the sea. Anytime you see that word maritime. And in addition to maritime technology, so like better ship building, there's also better knowledge of the monsoon winds. These are winds that, hopefully you learned this last year in geography, they're occurring reliably at the same time, and so it affected when people traveled. They could use those winds to their advantage. And so this stimulates exchanges along the maritime route, so think Indian Ocean trade. This is a short video that I was going to show you guys in class about Chinese ships known as junks. And again, you can follow this link if you access the Google Slides via Google Classroom. This particular key concept is starting to get into the decline of the Han, like why did this dynasty not last forever until modern times? And one of the reasons is the spread of disease. So if you're thinking about the Silk Road, while they're trading goods, they're also sharing germs. And so these disease pathogens hurt urban populations, and they help lead to the decline of certain empires. We're going to talk about Rome later, but right now we're talking about the Han, and it's things like smallpox. All right, so same key concept. We're talking about trade and what else was traded, not just goods, but disease, and also ideas and cultural traditions. So the important one here is Buddhism, because Buddhism is going to spread from India into East Asia. Okay, and it says they were transformed as they spread, partly as a result of syncretism. Okay, this is a word that we'll talk about in class a lot more, but I want you to define that word if you don't know what it means. Syncretism is when parts or pieces of a cultural or religion are adopted into another culture or religion. We're going to look at 2.2 really quickly one more time. Again, this has to do with competition. It says through excessive mobilization of resources, so they're expending all their resources, as well as the erosion of political institutions, so we start to see some of that political administration fail a little bit, along with economic changes and social tensions. All of these things are going to lead to the fall of the Han Empire. Also, it says concentrating too much wealth in the hands of elites. So in other words, when we think back to that slide about the social structure, that scholar gentry or the aristocracy, they own all the land, they have all the money, and there's just not enough to go around. The majority of the population is they're peasant farmers, and this causes problems. All right, and last but not least, all of these different empires end up having security issues along their frontiers. So the threat of invasion, this is why the Great Wall of China was built, okay? But, we saw that video on the Great Wall of China in class. Even though it was there, it didn't always work. There's multiple groups, multiple nomadic invaders from the north that end up coming in and challenging the emperor and leading to the fall of the Han dynasty. One of your vocabulary words in the Quizlet is Xiongnu, which is a group of Asiatic Huns. Okay, think about Mulan, and remember they're fighting the Huns. This is a nomadic people who basically come down south into the Han dynasty and contribute to the fall of the Han.